kind of is a history of my life, per se. And so a lot of the figures that are up here are people that I actually knew. And you're going to say, well, how far back did you go? Pretty far. So part of my history, right, is how many of you are from Texas? Okay, Texas. And you know about the 6 flags that flew over Texas, right? And you know that at one time, this used to be part of Mexico, right? Do you remember which state it was in for Mexico? No.
7th grade Texas history.
Quite all right. Not too many people know it was the state of Coahuila at one time. But having said that, there were a lot of people that when Texas became a state, that we were already here of Mexican descent, our ancestry, you know, our Native American community many times. When the Republic became independent, they decided that everyone that was not Caucasian or white would be Mexican. So you had many Native American communities that all of a sudden became Mexican as well. So even though I look back at my heritage and my parents, their families came from the state of Michoacan in Mexico, and it's in the middle part of Mexico. And in that particular area, there is a indigenous tribe called the Purabech, and they date back hundreds of years, even before the Aztecs. And the saying goes is that they were known to be negotiators, so they were never conquered by the Aztecs. They always negotiated their way out. So I think that talent kind of hit me somewhere. At any rate, so what you're seeing here is really dating back to the early 1900s, and the mural itself takes into account a lot of the symbolism and community of the Mexican community in Houston. Eventually became Mexican Americans, and then we became Chicanos, and then we became Hispanics, and then Latinos, and Latin Americans, and Latinx. So as you will see, I think one of the main themes of this mural is the family. It's a multi-generational culture. So it's mom, dad, plus grandparents. Very important to our culture. And as we talk about the Mexican community and our heritage, right? We all come back to this because it's very important to know about family and how it affects education, how it affects employment, housing, all of the, even, what we eat. So in this beautiful mural, it was actually painted by Jesse Cifuentes and Laura Lopez Cano, 2 Latino artists, and it brought in not only our history, but also the dynamic of male and female that I think is prevalent also in this mural. See, a lot of people depict the Hispanic community as macho, the man, the authoritative type of discipline, and it is true. I came from a family of 9 plus mom and dad. There were 11 of us. And so this is important because the way my grandfather came to Houston was based on the railroad. There was a huge influx of labor that was brought from Mexico into the United States in the early 1900s. And it's only 100 years of history, so it'll be an hour and a half. The history of the railroad, bringing the laborers into the United States, and they were incredibly determined to bring minerals. So all of the railroad ties and was from Mexico into the United States, south to north. You did not see any east to west railroads being laid in Mexico. It was all coming to the U.S. And in it was the laborers that were coming in. So my uncle, my great uncle, was one of the first to arrive in Houston in the early 1900s. And from grandfather, his brother. So they grew up in an area of the near downtown called El Aracran, which was the Scorpion. It was a neighborhood. It was a barrio. And needless to say, there were a lot of labor focused and tied to the railroads. My grandfather was here in the 1900s, and it was a thriving Mexican business community. And we were growing. But in the 1930s, during the Depression, there was a huge removal of Mexicanos throughout the United States. Not a lot of people know about that. My father was already born in 1926. My father is still alive. He's 96 years old. And we grew up in the barrios. We grew up Dad grew up in El Alacran. I grew up in what is called a Crisol, which was in the 5th Ward. And I thought Crisol meant beautiful God, El Sol, sun. It was for the Crisol plants. It's in the 5th Ward, and it's the cancer cluster that they're talking about right now. So we were growing up in this neighborhood, and life was tough. It was not easy. So the main focus of our community is get an education and get the heck out of the barrio as soon as you can. These were among the first of our community that actually went on to Rice University, onto some of the major universities, became doctors and professors. Baseball was very, very, very integral to our community. But this was a segregated community, okay? So in the segregation, we had to have our own leagues, just like, the Women's League. We had our own Mexican League. What you see up here are some of the buildings. This is the LULAC House, League of United Latin American Citizens. That particular organization was to fight civil rights and economic development and education and all sorts of issues that were plaguing the community. Back in the early 1900s, it still exists. I am part of LULAC Council 60. That particular council started in 1934 here in Houston, and it's still relevant. That particular house was bought in 1955. It is in Montrose. It's off of Bagby, 3004 Bagby. It is now recognized as a national treasure. And this national treasure is amongst two here in Houston. One is the Astrodome, and the other one is the LULAC House. It is the National Trust for Historic Preservation gave it that designation. We're now in the process of restoring the house and all its history and everything that involved. And that house really is the history of our Mexican American community that has evolved throughout the different years. Actually, all the planning, all the strategy, everything was from these individuals meeting in that house and figuring out what to do. Everything from the school segregation. We actually fought Hernandez versus the state of Texas, that for the first time recognized our community as a separate, identifiable minority community, and allowed us to be able to serve our juries. Because in the past, we were designated as white. And so when you had an all-white Caucasian jury, we were included. Not. But that's the logic they had back then. We had Desavalas Elementary. Again, segregation. We had individual schools that were only solely attended by Mexican students. Our community was very split. If you know anything about Houston, we were in wards, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th ward, 5th ward. And certain communities were not allowed to live in other communities. Just like our African American brothers, we also suffered the same type of discrimination, oppression, exclusion, and let's go on. We have here, of course, again, the labor, the Port of Houston, again, one of the key economic locations for our community to be employed. A lot of it was labor, labor, labor. My father worked as a laborer for, I guess, about 45 years. And how he raised nine kids on a labor salary, I don't know. It was, my mom always added an extra deal of beans in the pot. And big old stack of tortillas, and I'm the one that made the tortillas. So. And speaking of tortillas, this is Ninfa Lorenzo. Everybody know about Ninfa's Mexican restaurant? Ninfa has an incredible story as well. She became a widower at a very young age. She needed to take care of her kids, and before you knew it, the only thing she could do was start selling tacos and Mexican food out of a little house. Eventually it grew into a nice restaurant, and eventually it grew into a franchise. She did very well. She became an ambassador to our city. She traveled and as an ambassador for our communities, and not only our Mexican community, our Mexican American community, but for the city at large. And one thing, of course, that we know about Houston is that it is a very diverse city, and because of that, inclusion is encouraged now. We have, of course, the family, the children, and education, also very much part of what we're talking about here. El Teatro Azteca is one of the first theaters. Again, it was a Mexican cinema place, and that was the only place we could actually go see a movie for the longest time. And the Azteca was also known not only to have American movies, but they were also known to have movies, international movies, that would come and play, and not only from Mexico, but from all over Latin America. Now, you wonder, how do we make ends meet? Well, as a family, we actually worked together. And my dad said we need to supplement income. So the way we did it was we actually worked together as a maintenance crew for one of the largest nightclubs in Houston, called the Pan American Nightclub. The Pan American Nightclub, again, was a place for entertainment. One thing my dad always taught us was you work hard, you play hard. So dance was part of our culture. It was music and light, and so this particular club was actually owned by Lebanese Americans. And they knew that our Hispanic community, our Mexican community, wanted good entertainment. So on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, there would be dances. And the dance floor, 2 dance floors, would be as big as this whole plaza, plus another one. Plus tables and chairs and jukebox and you name it. It was huge. And then, of course, the stage. Huge stage, again, orchestras, not just your run-of-the-mill, trio or anything, orchestras. This was high caliber. They would fly them in from all over Latin America. They would have these incredible symphonies, and the best place to dance, because we made sure we polished the floor really well. And we cleaned up really well. I learned to dance polkas with my mom. So I always tell people that we had to create fun. Again, we are a community that was excluded. We were a community that we were trying to find ways of helping each other. KLVL became an essential mode of communication. That was a radio station. That was a Spanish-speaking radio station, one of the first. It was actually owned by the grandparents of one of our state representatives right now, Cristina Morales. And Mr. Morales and his wife Angelita were actually morticians, and they had a business called the Morales Funeral Home. Again, we're segregated. The reason they put it together was because we could not get funeral services just anywhere. So they made it a point to create their own funeral services serving the Mexican community. And in the process, they started a radio station. The radio station became the key to connecting community. Everything from there's a hurricane coming, you guys get ready, to where to find employment. And all in Spanish. Okay, and they even had an hour Bautista. We had a Reverend Navarro that was known for years to come on the radio and talk about civil rights, talk about things to do, and in education, how to access information, how to access services and so forth. Essential to our community that was only Spanish speaking. Now, a lot of you may think, why didn't y'all ever learn Spanish? The reality is that we do. We're like any other immigrant group that comes in, and by the first generation, we'll have learned the language. The situation is, though, our immigration is constant. Remember, we were here, 1933, we were removed. In 1944 and 1950s, we were brought back in with the Bracero program. In the 1960s, we were thrown out, Operation Wetback. In the 1970s, we were brought back in. All sorts of policies and treaties. Okay? So every time a new crew came in, guess what? They didn't speak English. They had to learn. But their children still learn. So I would be considered a second generation. So we have Lidia Mendoza. Lidia Mendoza became not only a local performer, but a state, national, and international as well. Her singing was just amazing. She sang like an angel, but she sang about the stories of our community, very much like Dolly Parton. Well, maybe not. But you catch my drift. She was one of our first female singers and artists, very well known and very much loved by the community. This is Centeno, Roberto Centeno. He was born without an arm, and he was able to play the trumpet with one arm. Absolutely amazing. I got to hear him before he died. He was able to play in some of the best nightclubs, not only here locally, but in other cities. And, he was sought after by some of the best, performers to perform as well. Eventually, he decided to come back to Houston, and him and his family put together their own group called the Centenos. And we have, Gloria Centeno, who is daughter-in-law. She just started the nonprofit Barrio Dogs, and that particular nonprofit helps community, especially our barrios, to deal with all of the overpopulating of dogs and so forth. But also Norma Centeno. Norma Centeno was one of the she's on the other mural. Norma Centeno was also an incredible performer, his daughter, and she died of cancer about five years ago. Young, beautiful singer, absolutely very talented, and again, could have gone anywhere in the United States to be a performer, but decided to keep her talent here and allow our community to endure. The red building here is the Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. It was built in 1900s. It's over 100 years old. Once again, it was built for the Mexican community in Houston. It was segregated, right? And luckily, they documented every birth. Because when I told you that my father was born here in 1926, and he was removed in 1933, he didn't have proof of his birth here in the United States. So when he returned to Houston, he had nothing. But Mrs. Morales, Christina's mother, knew what was happening to many individuals that had been born here in Houston. So she went to the church and got their baptismal records and was able to get a delayed birth certificate for my father to show that he was born here in Houston. So, Our Lady of Guadalupe, still there, beautiful church. If you ever get a chance, it has a school as well, a Catholic school. Get a chance to go and visit. Siempre. We have our Boy Scouts. Felix Fraga. Felix and his family, the Fraga family, have been probably one of the most successful, endeared families here in Houston. His brothers, Angel Fraga was a judge. Lupe Fraga was a businessman, very, very successful with penthouse office products. And Felix, for them, was a social worker and worked in the community for many, many years via the Ripley House, which is now Baker Ripley. And he invested his whole life and still lives. He's probably in his mid-90s now. And at one time, he also served as a city council member for District I and became involved in politics. The nicest man and the gentlest of souls, this man is just loved by many, many in our community. Next to him is Cristina Morales. Cristina is our state representative, State District 145, Democrat. Cristina, again, her parents, her grandparents, Angelita and Morales, Felix Morales, owners of Morales Funeral Home. She became an orphan at a very young age as a teenager. And so her grandmother actually raised her. And eventually she was left with a funeral home and the Morales Foundation. And because of that, she really invested time and energy in community. And eventually, she too got the political bug, and she ran for office. And I became her treasurer, and she won. So now she represents state representative for 145. Irma Galvan. Irma Galvan, also one of our wonderful business women. Again, her story is one of success. Has worked very, 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 very hard for many, many, many years. Irma was the typical Mexican housewife, raising her children, you know, but eventually her husband wanted to become a doctor. So she had to go back to work to help him through medical school. Unfortunately, we had a huge crime rate going on in the barrios, and her husband got killed one New Year's Eve. So she was left a widow with 4 kids. And she said, now what do I do? So she opened up a little sandwich shop across the street from where she had been working in the criminal justice area over there by Minute Maid Park at a time where, you know, it was just vagrants. But she was able to convince the courthouse personnel and the police officers and constables to start going through the place. And eventually it became a little Mexican restaurant. Then she opened up a little section, and then she widened it, and then she added. And now it's become Irma's Mexican restaurant. And she's probably, again, one of the most successful business women. She became very wise, and she also invested a lot in the East End real estate. She's a happy camper and she still works. So I hope you go and visit her restaurant one day. We have over here, Leonel Castillo became our first Latino Mexican American controller for the city of Houston. And he too was one of the first to be voted citywide. We have Yolanda Navarro Black. Yolanda was an advocate. She created many nonprofits, and as a matter of fact, one of them is the, what is it? It actually has, as a nonprofit, to raise funds for shoes for kids in the community. And I mean, hundreds of pairs of shoes. And the kids come over, and they get a chance to get fitted and get a new pair of shoes. And she started that many, many years ago.
And their event is tonight.
Their event is tonight. Go have a margarita. At any rate, Yolanda was also a very vocal advocate for education. One of the key things that she always felt was, as our community is growing, we need to assure that they become an educated community. And as I often tell everyone, I said, you either want an educated Mexican taking care of you, or an uneducated one, which reality is right now in this area, we're at 46% of the population. And I can go into, we're 70% of Mexican descent, and the 30 other percent is all others. Cubanos, Puertorriqueños, Venezolanos, Nicaraguenses, Colombianos, and the list goes on. So, we have the panaderias and the abarrotes and the taquerias. These are all types of businesses that were found in our barrios, in our community. And I was telling people, when you came into our little barrio and you saw it, to your left was the panaderia. You came down a couple of blocks, it was the Catholic Church. You went down another block and it was the grocery store. It was the chicken. You went down a little further with the notary public. And then on the back was a cantina. So you had everything you needed as a community in terms of what was necessary for us. Again, services were not ever really provided. You did not have investors coming in and putting, all of these franchises into our community. And because of that, there was a lot of things that were lacking. It wasn't until the Cubanos came in the late 60s, the Cuban, that they ended up settling in our barrios because they couldn't speak English. But they had business sense. They were educated. They were prepared. So they ended up making their businesses into our own Mexican communities. Let's see, all the way back. Our art is very, very much part of our community. Lately we have had a Latino Art Now, which was done by the University of Houston. And right now they are creating a digital board that will allow you to look at any piece of art that is of Latino or Mexican community members, and you push it and it'll pop up and it'll let you know where it's found, who painted it, and the background on that piece. It's an amazing digital board.
And it will be here October 27th. So if you'll, it's a reception and everything. You're welcome to come.
So we continue with the vaqueros. The vaquero statue was actually done by Luis Jimenez, an incredible international artist. Died accidentally. But the controversy about that, okay, so we have what was that Jose Campos Torres. Yeah.
This is your board.
Yeah, Jose Campos Torres. So again, we had a very difficult time with law enforcement. As our African American community did as well. Torres. Jose Campos Torres was a young man that had returned from military service during the Vietnam era. And unfortunately, he ended up having an incident in the East Side. He got picked up by the police, and they took him to what was called the hole over there by the back. And he was beaten. They were going to teach him a lesson. They took him back to the jail, and unfortunately, the jailer said, he's too far hurt, injured. You got to take him to the hospital. So instead of taking him back to the hospital, they took him back to the hole. And they went ahead and threw him in the body. He unfortunately drowned, and his body was recovered on Mother's Day. And you can imagine how upsetting it was once we found out that he had been in HPD custody. The community grew very, very upset. We demonstrated, had riots, and eventually, this is where the Vaquero comes in. The Moody Park riots. A lot of people don't know about that particular time in our history, but Moody Park was in the North Side community. And it was supposed to be a Cinco de Mayo event. And the year before was when the incident happened. The following year, the verdict came down, the sentencing of the officers. they had taken the case out of Houston jurisdiction and they took it to Huntsville. If anybody knows about Huntsville, it is very pro law enforcement. They found him guilty, and but without intent. So they gave him a 1-year probation and a $1 fine. Okay. That really angered her. And because of that, there were riots and an uprising at Moody Park. They tried to quiet people down. There were all sorts of, demonstrations, walks, concerns. Community leaders came in, and they wanted to know, what do we need to do? What is it we can help? So it was kind of a peace offering. Well, let's do something. Let's bring some art to the park. Let's make it nice. And so they commissioned the work of Luis Jimenez, and it's called El Vaquero. And again, El Vaquero is a symbol of what it was like, here in Texas. But when he presented the initial piece to the city leaders, it didn't have the gun. And when he finally finished it, it had a gun. So the community again was like, we don't need this. We don't need to have focus on this. I did speak to him at one time, and I asked him, because we were trying to, this was in the 90s, many years later, and we were trying to redo Moody Park. And we were trying to get people to settle down, because that was the first thing they wanted to leave. Do you know how much that thing costs now? Anyway, suffice it to say that I kept saying, no, let's concentrate on everything else and leave the statue alone. But their deal was, we don't want that gun in our community. I think the mayor's buyback program would do well right now. But back in the 90s, it was still a very contentious matter. And again, when I spoke to the artist, of course, artist liberty, right? This is the way I see it. This is what I want. It ain't gonna change. And his deal was, and in reality, right? As a vaquero, if you're out in the wilderness, you need a gun. For rattlesnakes or poachers or whatever. So that became a tool. To him, it wasn't an instrument of violence. It was a tool for the vaquero. So we left it alone. Now the charros in the background up there, right? On the horses. Yeah, on the horses. Again, we have the old and the new. The vaqueros, the tejanos, the rodeo. Everybody speaks of the rodeo. Well, the vaqueros were here, part and created really the charreadas. That was how it really entered into Texas. And then right behind there is the lowriders. Those are vehicles that are converted. They do all sorts of fancy hydraulics and paintings on the vehicles, all the way to the right up there. Those are the lowriders. And if anybody knows about California history in the Mexican-American, the Zoot Suit riots in California, that was way back in the early 1900s as well, 1940s, I think. And that was the soldiers coming back from the war, and they found a group of Mexican youth in Zoot suits, and they beat them up. And it was a riot that started. And so the lowriders, the vehicles are a distinction. It became a fad. It became a way of saying we're different. This is our thing, right? And now they have these clubs, these car clubs all over the United States. And again, they take these old vehicles, they paint them, and they're in the art car parades. Art car parades and all. And they have that hydraulic system, so they go up and down and all the way around. Okay. Did you want to talk about this person right here? This is Felix Tijerina, right? Yes, that's him. Felix Tijerina is a community member, that had Felix's Mexican restaurant. And his affiliation was one of the